Yes, we have to do more to defend Ukraine. Yes, we have to do more also on tanks. But the most important and the crucial part is that we do it together and that we do not do the blame game in Europe, because we are fighting a war against Russia and not against each other. Thank you.
Today, I'm announcing that the United States will be sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, the equivalent of 1 Ukrainian battalion. Secretary Austin has recommended this step because it will enhance the Ukraine's capacity to defend its territory and achieve its strategic objectives. The UK, the United Kingdom, recently announced that it's donating Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine. France is contributing AMX-10s, armored fighting vehicles. In addition to the Leopard tanks, Germany, like the United States, Germany is also sending a Patriot missile battery. The Netherlands is donating a Patriot missile and launchers. France, Canada, the UK, Slovakia, Norway, and others have all donated critical air defense systems. Poland is sending armored vehicles. Sweden is donating infantry fighting vehicles. Italy is giving artillery. Denmark and Estonia are sending howitzers. Latvia is providing more Stinger missiles. Lithuania is providing anti-aircraft guns. And Finland recently announced its largest package of security assistance to date, all to help counter Ukraine's brutal aggression that's happening because of Russia.
Evelyn, are you seeing any places that you think regimes are faltering? We have a lot of authoritarian leaders out there. Putin, are you seeing any signs of cracks in terms of stability there? Could that be a surprise, a 2023 surprise? North Korea? Any place that you're looking at in terms of a potential regime change that could destabilize a region or the world?
Well, obviously, a big one would be Russia, but I don't think they're on the precipice there. I think things have to get worse economically, and there have to be many more body bags and, frankly, military losses before there's a change in the government in Moscow.
Welcome to What's Left, the weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson, and writer-teacher Jessica. We're online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find that link to our blog in the episode notes. And you can also find our personal social media handles as @Don Eduardo Barca and @ZeptiKE on Instagram for Kenny Cepeda, and Jess's Twitter handle as @JHomie89. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. Thank you. Right. So today we'll be discussing the war in Ukraine, the war that's happening in Eastern Europe. This is an ongoing episode that we've been having on Ukraine, Russia, NATO, the USA's involvement. And I think that unlike other media sources or unlike other YouTube channels or other podcasts, I think we discuss it in a very different light. I appreciate Andy for having sent us some information that we'll be discussing, and we'll have the links to it in the description below. But we'll be giving our thoughts on the ever-evolving and long, I think over now 10 months of this war in Ukraine that's been going on.
It's almost a year, isn't it? February? It's almost a 1-year anniversary.
You're right. I said almost 10 months. I said, yeah, you're right. Yeah. I think the article that I read that you sent, Andy, said 10 months and it was written in November. So yeah, I thought 10 months then. But you're right, Jess. It will be a year. Yeah.
Easy.
So, I mean, Andy, you seem to find relevance in the reasons why we discuss this. I don't know why. Maybe you could share from there. What's your take on it, or what you would like to further discuss?
Yeah, I mean, we had that episode where we talked about what are the things that we kind of pay most attention to. Eduardo, you brought up politics in Mexico. Jessica, why did we said it was about pedos for you, but that's not what you're paying attention to. You were watching something that was taking place with regards to like, can you remind me what it was that you were following?
I don't remember. I have no recollection of this. Of what? Yeah, I think you're referring to something specific. Oh, it was like 3 different. I thought you were talking about our Ukraine episode, and I was like, I don't remember bringing up pedos in relation to Ukraine. Although I know, like, you know, Hunter was over there and stuff.
Right.
But anyway, okay, yes, it was. I can't remember, but it was something along those lines.
I remember she was talking about feminist issues, but also like UK politics, because it's something sometimes we don't focus on that side of the world.
Yeah.
And so she brought up at that time an organization that is in the UK that made some headlines that didn't make it here.
Mermaids. That's what it was. Oh, okay.
But your side or your lens or you tend to focus on that, or it's part of within the scope of what you look at.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. So long.
Yeah. I mean, and so this thing, I mean, I just have to say, I'm sort of infatuated with following this conflict, because I have gone from thinking way back in our last episode back in February, I think it was February of last year, going like, this ain't gonna happen, to what you said when it did happen, Jessica, this is World War III. And I was like, she's probably right, but really? Well, I have come to the belief that it's like I'm obsessed with watching how this unfolds, and seeing if it's going to unfold in the way that I think it might unfold if Marx is right about capitalism. Because if Marx is right about capitalism, this doesn't end well unless we have a revolution. With that obsession, which I talked about last time, occasionally there are events that take place and things that I read and things that I find that I'm going like, I have to share with Eduardo and Jessica. And if Kenny were here, although he's on leave for right now, and some people asked about where he's at, and he's just on leave and he'll be back later. I just want to share these things with you and see what y'all make of it, and then share together and share to you what I see in this, and then see what you make of what I'm saying, you know. Just sort of collaborating in this way intellectually, so I can get a better understanding of what do I think is really going on. Because like I said, the thing that's hard about this is just like, so they said that COVID was super dangerous, and it was not. They said the vax was super effective and safe and effective, and it literally was the opposite. They said they had the Russiagate thing where Trump was a Manchurian candidate and it was the opposite. And so I think there's a similar thing going on here, where the mainstream narrative is Russia is taking a beating from Ukraine with the support of the West. And I think the truth is the opposite again. And that's what I want to discuss with y'all, and what I think that means. Because, and I guess I will say my punchline is that these people who I'm reading, I think their insight is valuable to me. But they think that this ends with Russia winning the war and Ukraine losing and Russia just sweeping over. I mean, it's not going to be easy, but they see that's what's happening. And I think that is actually true in terms of where things are moving. But I don't think Russia wins this war. And I want to talk about why I would say that.
So I will share from just like what I've heard on mainstream news in comparison to what I find in my reflections over the things you have shared with us.
Yeah.
Because, I do listen to KPFA, which is my local station, and they have found listeners going against their news or their coverage, and they find that they've been disingenuous and as a long-standing anti-war kind of station, and so they're getting a lot of calls, I've noticed. And so I think for me, what's interesting is how much the callers are calling in, which is unfiltered, and then versus what's being shared on the station. And so that's where I'm getting my mainstream news from currently. And in contrast, what you're sharing. So I'd like to. That's where I think I'll do my share.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this whole war, well, like the past year, I don't know, it's definitely highlighted, like, for me, to myself, truly how skeptical I am of literally any media source, because I mean, I truly, like, do not know what to believe. And I mean, that's the case for anything. Like, I think we've all trained ourselves pretty well, especially since COVID. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's been a lot of focus, right, these past couple of, I guess, days or couple of weeks on like the actual weapons and artillery, right? In terms of like literal warfare that's going on. So I guess I view it. I'm viewing it through, probably above everything else, I'm viewing it through the information warfare lens, like on a global scale. And I guess, information warfare is working when somebody like me, like, literally doesn't know what to believe, or just, I don't know. It's like, it's very easy, honestly, just to kind of dismiss. Like, I don't know. I'm kind of impressed of like how obsessed, as you put it, Andy, you are. Because I think when you're so skeptical, like, it's a lot easier just to like not even really look into it, and you obviously can't be looking into everything at once. But yeah, I mean, and then so information warfare, the two articles that you sent focus a lot on like warfare tactics, artillery on the ground, what weapons does who need, and what, areas are strategically important for whichever side to capture. So I don't really know what to think. I mean, I don't have military strategy training, and I don't have uh, much idea of that. I've never been to that area of the world, but yeah, I mean, so like these tanks are going over, right? And I like, just on the World War. Sorry, I'm like jumping around a lot. No, I'll stop and let you guys jump in. But last year Biden literally said, if we start sending tanks and like that level of material shit, like, that's called World War III. Like, he had said that almost word for word. And yet here we are. So I don't know. I think you said last weekend, you're like, we're in it. We are already in World War III. And I do think, I'm sure we'll talk about, as we always do with this issue, for good reason, like the nuclear threat aspect of it, which I heard the other day. I was listening to Whitney Webb on something. Maybe it was her own. Maybe it was Unlimited Hangout, like her own podcast, I think. And she said something that really kind of struck me. And I don't think she was arguing that this is going to happen. I think she was rather just sort of floating this as something that is not beyond the realms of possibility. That, I mean, obviously we would all be terrified of the literal reality of somebody using a nuclear weapon. But she was like, their propaganda war and information war is so robust and extreme. And so much of at least the American public seems to, or at least, I don't know, on the left, I guess, in the mainstream, seems to eat it up, to the point where she was like, they could very easily convince a good portion of the American public and, probably the NATO country public that a nuclear weapon was used, for instance, by Russia, without it actually even happening. Which I was like, man, I kind of agree that, like, they could probably pull that off. I mean, just think of like all the psyops the past couple of years. So it is, I don't know. Yeah, it's just, I feel like this war is being carried out on so many different levels, which, I mean, I guess that's the case for any war, but I guess I'll stop there for now.
the way that I have been listening to this is through the through just like listening to what like mainstream, what people on the left say is mainstream, like CNN, and then Fox, and then listening to it on the side of what alternative news pretends to be. I think now I don't. Democracy Now, KPFA, Upfront. Let's see, even just the mainstream, I would say leftists like Ralph Nader and everyone else that is on the left of these alternative media sources that are, and these are the ones that are not as challenged when it comes to like left junkies. I think for me that this comes in light of like Germany giving away these tanks, the recent tanks that were being hesitant to be shared. And there were these, I think, which not so much technical, but more political optics of why they would be so hesitant to share these tanks when Poland was wanting to share or give these tanks over in spite of Germany's hesitancy. Is I think that this is what they didn't want to look like again entering war when Germany was in World War II, one of the main countries that was looked at when the Soviets were there. And this is for them like a very sensitive issue of deciding to bring or take over or hand over war material. And they're trying to keep as much as that like away from that kind of image as possible. And the USA, I think, sent about like 30 tanks, and Germany sent about 14, and Poland was willing to send 14. So this is all of this as I'm thinking about this conflict in the midst of all of this weapons manufacturers, and there are areas that I agree with some of the things that I have read in What's Ahead in the War, from the article that was shared about the strategies, the different strategies, and Russia Matters, the article that you sent.
Was that the Scott Ritter one? The Scott Ritter one or the other one?
The Alex Vershinin.
The Colonel dude.
Oh, good. Yeah.
The other, yeah. And so there, especially when it comes to the strategy, I didn't think of it in this way. I'm glad it was outlined as it was, but there were territories that Russia took in the very beginning, and it was very seemed a bit like it was on the winning side, right? In the very beginning, that it seemed like, and then you have Ukraine, it just taking up. It says here like shrinking Russian control to roughly 50% of the territories they had captured since the 24th, and so their different strategies is what gives me a chance to see how this conflict is evolving. Ukrainian strategy is of like pursuing a terrain-focused war of maneuver, and Russia is more about like slowing down this war to make it as long as possible. What I do hear in the mainstream news, CNN, BBC, Fox, is that Russia is losing the war. That's the way that I hear it. That's what I've been reading as well. It's just as it slowly they are, they've captured these, and then suddenly Ukraine recaptured, and then they've fled, and Russian soldiers have fled certain territories, and they've even taken even parts that were before, like Crimea, close to Crimea. Sorry, my pronunciation, like the Kherson region, taking over the West Bank area that I'm looking at the map right now, like even just areas that were mostly Russian controlled or influenced by the Russian side. This is what is the narrative that I'm listening to, that this is like victory after victory for Ukraine. This is what I'm hearing. Now that I'm after re-examining it and analyzing what you've shared, and we'll link in the episode notes, it's that it isn't as it is being portrayed. There are casualties on both sides, but it is Russia's, I don't know if it's a winning or losing, it's just more of just like Russia's strategy is prolonging to the point where Ukrainian military is getting depleted energetically, especially during the winter months. This is the roughest time for them to be in war during the winter because of the extreme weather patterns that exist there. And especially during November and December, that was very hard for them. And I think it was very terrible, in my opinion, that from what I've understood from the news, that Russia attacked the sort of energy source for Kiev to have their people the energy source they needed for heating, which I thought was horrible on their part. But I'm not tracking this war with the scrutiny that I feel these writers are, or maybe you are, Andy. I'm just giving a sort of broad understanding from a person that's kind of a layperson reading this from different sources. And it's this episode has challenged me on some like the militaristic strategies and ways that people see this from, I don't know, the point of view of like military, like the army, right? Like this is not my my area of expertise or anything. I'm not that like familiar or versed in these in the language of military, but it does give me more perspective, and it also makes me feel connected when I do delve into the specifics of these regions and look at the map and then go back and see where Belarus, for example, just how close it is and how they also are hesitant to participate. But then, they've got their own political turmoil. And, as Mexican, we're in Mexico, there's a neutral position on it. There's no support or for or against. So that's also the other thing that influences me. It's not like here where people, especially the Democrats, are pro-military funding, which I see the changing tide for the Republicans. They're not willing to be so pro-military funding as the Democrats are.
Well, unless you're talking about against China.
Yes. Yeah. So that's it for now. I also think that what's ignored and what's also connected in the very background is how North Korea is also doing these military exercises, and how they're supposedly also supplying Russia with sort of, I don't know, some of the also weaponry that they need or something.
And Iran.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Didn't they find some soldiers or some folks that were also not Russian necessarily? They were like other foreigners.
The biggest thing I know of is the use of drones and what they call those suicide drones that Iran seems to have developed, and that Russia might have gotten them from them to strike into parts of Ukraine.
So that's it. That's what my first impressions are, and that's what I'm just sharing from my point of view.
Yeah, I mean, maybe first off, it is literally to oppose, like that thing you're describing of Russia's losing and Ukraine is advancing. There have been those statements, and the West is like the incompetent Russian army, and they're just doing human wave attacks and putting it out as if there was a number thrown out by a NATO person in Europe that said that 100,000 Ukrainians soldiers had been killed. That's killed in action. That's not casualties. That's killed. Usually casualties are 3 times that. But then that number got pulled away. Like it was literally swept. They tried to scrub it, when that person had said it in public, because they don't want that number to be out there. But I think I talked to people who think that Russia has lost 2 to 3 times more than the Ukrainians have lost. And that's because of the news, and if that was the case, this would be a hands down, if Russia was even equaling Ukrainian losses, or even 1 to 2, I would say, like 50,000 to their 100,000, I would say this would be a tremendous victory for the United States in terms of what it wants to do, because the reason they're doing this, is they are using Ukrainian blood and Ukrainian land to bleed Russia. And we have to go back to the 2018 and then the 2022 the National Defense Strategy that basically said the United States sees the major competitors to the U.S. to the democratic world and to the U.S. hegemony, which they don't put it that way, but that's what it is Russia and China. Now we know China is the major one, but Russia is the secondary. And so the reason I'm so fascinated by this is I feel like I've been paying attention to this since at least 2018. And now I'm watching, like, it's like a deadly flower opening up. And also to see the nature of the war that's taking place. This isn't Iraq, like the shock and awe, although there seems to be, this is trench warfare. This is artillery. This is hundreds of thousands of people getting killed along front lines. This is slow movement. This is World War I and World War II again, without the nukes, right? And it's fascinating for me to see, oh my God, here it is again. And even there's an article I sent to you that was the CSIS, what are those people? Let me see. From the Center for Strategic Internet and International Studies. This is not an article you may have paid attention to, but they were doing a kind of a summary of, okay, where are we at? And they were basically acknowledging that the U.S. does not have enough munitions for modern war. And when they say modern war, they went back to using the term industrial war. That's a term of World War I and World War II. Industrial wars, when you use that term, mean that you defeat your enemy by destroying their industrial base, because their ability to fight a war is based on what they can produce. And that means you have to destroy the cities. And that's the nature of World War I. That's the nature of World War II. And we're now seeing United States, Russia, China, Iran, Germany, France, and all those people who were talked about being drawn in to what looks like an industrial war. And as the United States, I think, is struggling, they're already talking about, in that article at least, how do they win this, but also be prepared for a second front in China and Taiwan to fight industrial wars. And so I feel like, again, the reason I'm so enthralled by this is it seems to confirm everything that I have thought about the deadly nature of what is being entered into here. And also that what Jessica said about all these red lines that the U.S. is, like, they said, well, we're not going to send missiles and things that can do long range missiles, but then they sent the HIMARS and they sent artillery that could shoot long range, and that was their first red line. And now they're crossing another red line of sending tanks, and they're already talking about, while the U.S. is saying we're not sending our own F-16s, we are not going to stop the other countries that we would give F-16s to give some of their weapons, some of their planes too. So all these lines that are being crossed, to me, again, indicate or are part of an indication that things are not going well, and that the only thing that these powers can do in the context of things not going well is escalate, because that's what these things are, and that's what they must do. And so I watch it, and I'm fascinated by it, terrified by it, but it seems to be a confirmation of everything that I felt like where this war leads. I'll just say that the authors of most of the people I read, the Scott Ritter, Colonel Douglas McGregor, the Duran, History Legends is a YouTuber who puts some stuff out, and then some of these resources you've seen definitely say the opposite of what the mainstream news says. They would say, and while they would say that Russia got bloodied early in, because they would say because Russia was looking to move into NATO, move into Ukraine, to basically bring them to the table so they could get a settlement early on, and then Ukraine has built up as a defense fort for the last 8 years, and Russia fell into that kind of trap. So they did take some losses early on, and so what Russia has done is regrouped. They've mobilized a larger number of soldiers, and a larger number of equipment and built themselves into a war economy that can essentially, for every 6,000 munitions that the artillery shells that the Ukrainians fire, they can fire back 60,000. It's anywhere from 9 to 1 to 10 to 1. That's another reason why that hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers doesn't make any sense. The numbers that I believe that I've seen on other things are roughly 200 to 250,000 casualties on the side of Ukraine, and up to about 20,000 casualties. Maybe, and I guess I would say 150,000 to 200,000 killed for Ukrainian, and up to about 15 to 20,000 killed for Russia, which is a big number. But I think they're prepared to do it because they think this is an existential threat to have NATO right on their border. And the thing that was interesting in reading some of this was to see the degrees to which U.S. had built such an amazing defense perimeter in Ukraine, and built it in such a way that it was going to force a kind of war like this that Russia is fighting, but Russia is prepared to fight it, and to essentially see all the things that I feel like echoes of World War I and World War II return now. I just find I can't turn away from it in terms of looking at it. Where I see things like the stuff I was telling you about in terms of what's going on in Bakhmut and Soledar is just this general strategy, and that people are talking about Russia doing a major offensive with the forces that it's bringing from its mobilization that it happened since the summer or spring or fall. Maybe the mobilization was in the fall. But what Russia has been doing is fighting along that entire front, the Donetsk front. And they did give up ground in Kharkov. They did give up ground in Kherson. But in both those cases, they gave up land to minimize the losses, because the reason for those offensives that Ukraine went on was to try to actually capture military pieces, but also cut off troops and kill them. And that was not successful. They withdrew on both fronts. And in Kherson in particular, they withdrew and pummeled them with artillery as they withdrew. And so this was this guy, I didn't send this to you, but there was a soldier who's fighting in Ukraine, who's part of an Australian force, who basically said the Ukrainians lost a bunch of forces building up that, essentially chasing the Russians out of Kherson, and are not in any position to do a new offensive, largely because now what's happened in places like Soledar and Bakhmut this is again another World War I analogy that the one guy used of Verdun, where the Germans basically took a position someplace and the French had to come into it. And in doing so, it basically meant that the Germans could kill as many French as they possibly could as French tried to retake very difficult ground to retake. And that's what's going on in Bakhmut. Is Russia is slowly encircling Bakhmut. That is the first line of defense that the U.S. has built up since 2014 or 2016 when they did the coup. That line has been shattered. They are now at the second line of defense, which Bakhmut represents the central part of that second line of defense against Russia. And that place is seen as vitally important to maintain as probably one of the best defensible places if they're going to fight the Russians. And that is being slowly encircled. And as it gets encircled, Ukraine has to bring in more and more forces. They get shelled, people die, then they put more forces in. Again, this one military guy who is in southern Bakhmut basically is saying that his brigade was depleted 80% losses of just his brigade, which that is like 20% losses of units is actually something that really destabilizes it. 80%, I don't even know what to say about it. But he's just saying we are taking heavy losses. And again, you got to remember what's being reported is that Russia is coming along in human wave attacks in that region. And he's saying, no, it's not even the opposite. Russia is being, and the Wagner group and things like that is being very thoughtful about how they come in and making sure that whenever they come in, they have artillery to support themselves, that the casualty rates for us is way higher than it is for our opponent. But we have to keep putting forces in there to defend this strategically important place. And it's basically what they describe as a meat grinder, because Russia is destroying as many Ukrainian forces in this Bakhmut as they can while they encircle it. And then when those defenses are cracked, there's only one final line of defense. And it's not a very good line of defense. And that's in a situation where Ukrainian forces have been vastly depleted. As you read in that one thing, they've essentially gone through 3 phases of artillery. They had their initial artillery that they had as a Ukrainian army, that was destroyed. Then they regave them new stuff that was old Russian stuff and old Soviet stuff from other countries and that they had stored out in other places. All that's been destroyed. And now they're in a third wave of trying to give them US, NATO, new arms. And again, the belief is that this stuff's going to be destroyed, particularly because, as you saw, there's so much different stuff. And you have to train people to use this different stuff and the logistics for it. And so it just looks like an entire state is going to get destroyed in this, like Ukraine, in this battle. And the prognosis from the people who are opposed to what the US is doing in here is that Russia is going to have a decisive victory. I do believe Russia is going to be very, very successful in the coming months in killing Ukrainians and in destroying material and in even taking land. The part I disagree with is that it doesn't end in Ukraine. This war has always been about the United States versus Russia. And so on the horizon is already Polish reserves being called up, Romanian reserves being called up, US forces being stationed in Romania, US forces being stationed in Poland, European forces being talked about being put in next to that theater. And so I don't see this war ending. I do see Russia having a breakthrough and Russia having its own escalation that will then force a move on the part of the United States and NATO to make it so that Russia cannot win. And the situation I believe we're in is a situation that Russia cannot afford to lose this battle, and the US cannot afford to lose this battle. This is not like Afghanistan where they can walk out. I feel like we are now, big powers are coming up against each other, and neither can lose. And so the one area that I disagree with, that the people who I'm reading, Fritz, they just think that Russia is going to win so decisively that it's going to force the US to get Zelensky or the government to negotiate. And I don't see that. I think the US has to escalate, has to create a situation, even if the Zelensky government gets destroyed and gets taken out, even by its own military, which is one thing that people say might happen. I think we're going to see somehow the US is going to do something with Poland, and there's no way the US can allow Russia to win in that region. And that's why I think like this war has to expand, and it is World War III, and each thing of escalation that people said couldn't happen has happened. And I think we should think deeply about what that means for where these things escalate to. And that's what's fascinating me about this, because for all our talk of transhumanism and Web3 and whatever, I just feel this whole thing clears the board, like, of the planet, of humans. And so what are we talking about? Like, who's worried about transhumanism when basically all the cities have been destroyed by nuclear, whatever?
So do you see that as like the only, when you say like neither power can lose and it has to escalate, do you see nuclear as the only way that happens? Because it's like we can't keep pouring like weapons indefinitely.
Yeah, that's the thing that each of the people I've listened to, Duran, and Scott Ritter's probably the person who's most worried about it and says this might end in a cinder. But the other guys all seem to think that there's going to be a pullback at some point. And I think they all think that these wars are driven by policies, by administrations, by people. And they are not. This war, I believe, is being driven by a system. And there's no choice but victory when the system is when a global system is in a deep crisis, and the only way to get out of that crisis is some kind of victory and some kind of defeating your opponent. And so that's the difference, is that I think the people I'm paying attention to believe that policymakers can potentially be in control of decisions here and can basically walk back from that last moment. And that's for me, World War I and World War II show that that's not true. And I think we're seeing it again.
Do you call it a proxy war, Andy? Or Because I feel like you've been critical of that.
No, I would. I mean, I do think of it as a proxy war, but it's drawing more and more obviously those people who are using Ukraine as a proxy into that war. I would still call it a proxy war, but I've talked about it this way, which is Ukraine as a U.S. proxy to fight Russia. I sometimes think Russia is a Chinese proxy to fight the U.S. Because the one power that's sitting pretty, even though it's got some economic issues right now, is China. And China made that agreement early on with Russia about, hey, we got your back, dude. Go ahead and do what you need to do. We'll support you. And they have been. But to me, this is very interesting. This is a very similar role that the United States played in both World War I and World War II, as they sat back and let the fucking sides destroy each other and said, here we go. We'll take it next. And that's what I see China doing. And again, you can say, oh, well, China's going to win. I don't see it that way because the U.S. can't lose. I don't see how a U.S. power that has all these nuclear weapons, they're not going to let themselves lose with those things in the silos and in their submarines. No way. The only way that happens is a revolution inside the country, like the real January 6th, that like takes that shit away from them and says, we're taking it out of your hands. That's the only way this gets stopped.
Let me grab my pitchfork.
So that's what's been fascinating me about this. And I feel like the things I'm reading, and particularly to see that the U.S. is now in the context, in my opinion, of them recognizing that their hand is getting worse and worse in Ukraine, that now you see them beginning to talk about how they have to right now pivot to China. Like there's military guys coming out and saying, well, we got to prepare for a war within 1 to 2 years with China. Like that has all the hallmarks of a power embattled. But then what has to do with Germany does open up a second front. That's what they had to do. They thought they were just going to fight with the Russians. Didn't work out that way. They had to open up a second front. Didn't go so well for them. Didn't go so well for Napoleon either. And that's what the United States is openly saying they're going to do. A two-front all industrial war with big powers, against big powers. And they think that they're going to marshal Netherlands and Germany and Japan, Israel. Definitely Israel is going to be part of that. And that's partly what's being tested now is Israel, are you with us or are you with Russia?
And this also comes, Switzerland just recently began their sirens. They just, this today, I think it was. I wish you could check, but my internet is down. Their siren testing, what they used back in World War II. I hate to think that, politicians who are in the know are preparing for what's to come. I don't wish, and I've said it in other episodes, I don't wish a nuclear weapon be used, but it is being, even in science with like nuclear fusion, the wave of new energy, that's being designed mostly for military use, I'm sure.
And people who are against this war I believe are going to see in the coming months Russian advances and Russian victories. And I think they're partially going to celebrate that as a defeat for the U.S. And it partly is. It really is a defeat for Ukraine, but a defeat right now for Ukraine is a defeat for the U.S. and the West. And they're going to think, oh, if Russia gets over enough, then this thing will get settled and the war will be over. And that's where I think the people who are on my side of this question have got it wrong. It's like, there's nothing to celebrate. And I don't mean that in a moral way or even, oh, dead people are dying. Of course people are dying. I mean, I think a system's in play here. And there's no chance that the U.S. cannot be defeated here. And if it is defeated, it has to destroy the planet before it gets defeated. Any ruling, like that's the situation Putin had. This is why all the war gaming that they had done, always, like when they did the NATO war planners always talked about this, things ending in nuclear war because Putin was going to lose. Putin could not possibly defeat NATO on the ground. It now looks like actually the Russian military is in a much better position than what they thought But it works in reverse as well. If they know that Putin has to use nuclear weapons rather than lose a conventional war, then what do you think that means for, quote, our side? If the West is losing a conventional war, particularly when we're the US in particular is the only side that is actually said explicitly, we are prepared to do first strike if we have to, and we're willing to do first strike even if we're not threatened by a nuclear threat. If it's a threat that we think is large enough to our national security interests, we reserve the right to use our nuclear weapons. That was part of the National Defense Strategy of 2022. So if that's already on the books, stated, what do you think that power says when they're about to lose? They've already said it. So they know that Putin will lose nuclear weapons if that regime is faced with a crisis of its own existence. But that's true for the West and for the United States as well. So I don't see how, if they both can't afford to lose, how does this end other than nuclear war unless we stop our own governments? And that doesn't just mean us in the United States. That does also mean the Russian working class, because there's nothing to support there. It's not about fighting Nazis. It's not about Stefan Bandera, which I think that's a cover, right? I mean, the very interesting thing that I read in one of the articles that was talking about Russia, and in a somewhat sympathetic way, saying, well, the Russians have this mystique about World War II that it was the good war for them. They fought the Nazis. And I was like, duh, who else has that? What other country has this mystique about itself that they fought the good war and fought the Nazis? Everyone has gotten rich fighting the Nazis and gotten powerful fighting the Nazis. It wasn't about that. It was about taking land. The Nazis were a cover for it. They existed. But the whole system is, in a sense, deeply built on racism, sexism, all those horrible oppressions that we said the fascists and the Nazis were so militarism. That's our system. That's capitalism, dude. That's just capitalism when it's had a bad day and has a headache. So our system is essentially a fascistic system, particularly when it goes into crisis. When it's not in crisis, it doesn't appear so like that. But COVID showed a lot of its talons that it has, and I think we're now seeing even sharper claws come out in war.
That's what when you said, Andy, that this is not either side is willing to lose, I don't know, how do I frame it? How do I see it? I also began thinking that this was the US's war. Well, of course I thought, but how can people not think that this is the US's war when they're using Ukrainians to fight the war, but they're being trained by the US military. They are being used by the US military. They're being given weapons by the US military. They're being given strategic ways to use to fight Russia. They're even going to be given, if they have to, give to Ukrainian military nuclear weapons, except I'm sure being launched by US Americans secretly who are hiding under the guise of I'm Ukrainian, right? The Russia is not stupid that this is a war between NATO, the USA, and them, even though they're fighting Ukrainians. This is a war between NATO and the USA and Russia. So it is if Russia loses, they won't want to lose against NATO and the USA, and NATO and the USA won't want to lose against Russia. And we're all believing it's a Ukrainian fight. I mean, everyone's putting up their flags. I just saw it with my nephew just yesterday. We were walking down Folsom Street in San Francisco. I stand with Ukraine. I stand with the USA's fight. It's really what's going on here. But that's what the message is. We were all supposed to, in the very beginning of last year, as Jess noted, because we're coming up with its anniversary, we're all supposed to be in support of the Ukrainians because we stand for liberation. I mean, I think in an episode as well, I said, I'm guilty of saying, I stand for everyone's liberation. And if that's the Ukrainians want that liberation, then if this is their fight, I support it. But the more we've delved into this, it's obviously not. And I said that in the same way that I would say anybody, right? But but I guess it didn't belong in the episode, because I still believe anyone should fight for their liberation, but it didn't belong in the episode because this is not a Ukrainian liberation fight. This is two mega powers deciding competitively who's going to win, pretending it's the Ukrainian war. But I'm doubtful some, the pitchfork or the January 6th illusion, what you alluded to. I'm doubtful that we would even stop our government, because that's what I think we should do, because of the narrative that is controlled, that's being given to us, as I shared in the very beginning of my reflections, that I think what we're being told is the Ukrainians are winning, the Russians are fleeing, and all this sort of thing that we're being given through the mainstream news and even alternative sources. So, and then all the torture and the Ukraine, and someone came out just recently, the Russian, someone who in the BBC I was looking at, said that he's embarrassed, ashamed for being part of the Russian army, and has seen torture on part of the Ukrainians, which gives more sympathy, hope for the Ukrainian war, because it makes us want to stay in this fight. Just in the same way, I think, like the Afghan women are used to be able for folks to stay in the Afghan war. I still think, obviously, the Afghan women are being mistreated, and also in a sexist way being oppressed. But it's being used to weaponize folks to stay in these wars, and such torture is also being used by this army official who decided to come out and say that Ukrainians were tortured under his watch and also under his observations. It's being given the sympathy vote to continue this war. It's funny how. Go ahead.
No, sorry, Eduardo. Go ahead.
No, it's just funny how people are tricked into continuing wars, right? Like every war that we've been a part of, whether it's World War II, even like the Cold War, and let's not go too far, even like the Iraq War with the weapons of mass destruction. The pull for us to stay in it, to convince the public, is also part of the strategic force, right? Like it's part of in order for us to keep going for more than, how did they keep us for 20 years, 18 years in the Middle East? You have to be able to feed the public to keep being there, right? You have to be able to convince us. And so showing these tortured images and stuff of what happens in Ukraine is what's going to keep people we have to stay in this for the Ukrainians, right? It's what we have to do. It's the moral obligation. We have to do it for them. Sorry, Jess, you were saying.
No, I was going to kind of say the same thing. I just think, especially people who are, I guess, my age or younger, I was in middle school when 9/11 happened. It's has there been a day in my life when we haven't been at war in some capacity? And I agree with what you said earlier, Andy, about this not being Iraq, but I think it's a good point, the Afghanistan 20-year example that Eduardo just gave, just in the way that the American public has been fucking trained to just accept that oh yeah, those international wars going on over there, and yes, here's my taxpayer dollars, right? And they don't rise up and they don't question it. And I don't think a lot of people, including the people with the Ukrainian flags who are the loudest, democratic imperialists in our nation, are really, I don't think many of them are paying super close attention, on the level that you are, Andy, where I feel we need to get you one of those giant 3D in the movies, the wartime, move this here and that here. I'm joking, I'm laughing, but it's I don't know. Some of these articles, just reading about, even though I don't know, the specific weapons and stuff, I really have a visceral reaction to them, because it's all just You know, it sounds like a fucking game, and it's not. You know, I mean, like you're talking about, like, I mean, we don't know the real casualty numbers, but it's a lot of fucking people. So yeah, I don't have much stock. I don't know about the Russian people, but I don't have much stock in the American people to stop this. I mean, we spent the past couple years letting the government, you know, poison our children, brainwash everybody, poison the environment, right? Like they just walk all over all of us all the time. So, I mean, maybe if a nuclear war did happen, the survivors would maybe get up off their ass. But yeah, I don't know. Like I feel like we've gotten dumber, and it's great. Like even just this most recent like couple of videos the past few weeks. Like I know there was the Economist interview with the general colonel. I don't know the Ukrainian head military guy. And then like Zelensky's, you know, little infomercial where, you know, he's asking for, okay, like, thank you very much. We got our tanks, but now we'd like some more long range missiles, and we'd like some aircraft, we'd like some F-16 fighter jets, right? It's like he's like sitting, you know, flipping through a Raytheon or Boeing like catalog, literally being like, yes, I'd like this for Valentine's Day and this for Valentine's Day, you know? Like it's really wild to watch, especially like if you think back to like what, you know, the Biden quote that I was referencing earlier about like even, you know, and nobody, you know, obviously as a politician, like whatever, all it is broken promises and lies, right? Like since the beginning of time, but I don't know. Maybe I've just gotten more skeptical and smarter, but I feel like the war propaganda has gotten more and more overt over the years, you know. But it still works. It's still working. So here, since you've been kind of studying like the military logistics more closely, Andy, like. This is a bleak question, but like, what do you think a nuclear weapon being used or nuclear war would look like? Like, actually?
That I definitely. I definitely don't know. I'll say a few things that I've seen or read. First off, I did see what Whitney Webb was saying, and to me, I don't know if she said the term false flag, but I think what she is bringing up is entirely realistic, but in the context of false flag. Gulf of Tonkin, 9/11, the Pearl Harbor, where basically it really looks like FDR kind of pushed Japan to the point of having to fight and then put out the red meat of Pearl Harbor out there, knowing that they had enough of their fleet out of there that they could survive, but then they could draw the rest of the U.S. public into that war if they were attacked. So when I think about what the U.S. would do, I think of nuclear false flag. But the only problem with that to me is that first strike is really important. But I don't, and I've heard that generals talk about winning a nuclear war on the side of the United States, where the U.S. takes basically up to about 100 million casualties, but we win. So I've heard that. And then last are those simulations that say that the limited nuclear war starts in Europe and then spreads with the use of US and Russia launching missiles on each other. That is how I would see that whole thing unfolding. I don't believe in the limited nuclear war that doesn't involve bombs, many, many bombs dropping on many, many cities. That's the thing I would say I don't believe. And that's the way some people are talking about it. Like you could possibly use these things just in a military theater, almost like taking out, artillery pieces and things like that. I don't believe that nuclear war can ever be confined to that place.
They can't even do like individual drone strikes without killing civilians.
Well, I mean, you could say, well, we're going to stay out of cities with these things, but I just don't.
Oh, great! So they'll just
Yeah, but if they get used there, inevitably, whoever takes the bad end of that exchange is going to then escalate to something that is not just on the military theater. It's going to have to, again, go back to the recognition that we are fighting an industrial war and must destroy our opponent's industrial base. And one of the ways that Russia is going to, one of the ways I think they will try to get us more ginned up to this war is Russia is going to have to destroy the cities that they go through. And they are doing that. Like if you look at they're just, it's like World War I and World War II things you saw with facades of buildings that are half up. I mean, it's just artillery after artillery barrage in order to save soldiers and to not have as many soldiers killed. Because you want to kill the other side more than you want your side to die. And no one's using human wave attacks, as far as I understand. Like there have been both sides have accused themselves of doing that. I don't think either side is looking to lose soldiers. But this is the weapons are deadly, and so many people are dying in a fairly short period of time. And so I do think it's going to. You will certainly see pictures of destroyed towns and cities, and they will be true. And that will be a sign of Russian victory or Russia winning, because that's what they're going to do as they roll up the rest of the Ukrainian army, because they are attempting to create a safe border where NATO and US can't operate. And they believe that they're fighting US and NATO by fighting Ukraine, because Ukraine has said we are NATO proxies. And so they have to do that, because that's the war. It's not good, but that's just the nature of the war.
And China will just sit and watch?
Well, I think the U.S., this is the part, I think the U.S. knows that they have to get China involved, because time is not on the U.S. side when it relates to competing with China. And so they have to, I do think China is sitting pretty, and I think the U.S. knows China is sitting pretty. And so they've got to involve, no, we're going to punch you in the nose. You got to get your nose bloody. And that's why I think they've put the time scale forward, because if the U.S. just waits and waits back in World War I or World War II, things don't get harder for the United States the longer these two sides destroy each other, Europe and Germany and Russia. It gets easier. And that's the situation China's in right now, as I see it. And so the U.S., that's why I think the U.S. is now talking. It seems crazy, but that's why I think they're now having military folks run up the time scale for when they think they'll be engaging China in military conflict, because they have to draw them in, because their military is only going to get stronger as both the U.S. and to some extent Russia gets depleted, but the U.S. is going to get depleted. And the other thing we're going to hear about is U.S. is going to be moving much more to a war economy, and munitions building munitions, turning. I mean, I think we're talking about in World War II, turning car factories into tank and munitions building factories. So I think we're going to
driving cars anyway. So convenient.
Right. So I think those are some of the developments we're going to hear about. I think I had heard that the U.S. felt like they had to have a 5-fold increase in the amount of artillery shells that they were getting out, because they're way behind in what they were. And then they've depleted their stocks in many ways from what they thought they had. And now they're going to have to become a war economy. So I do think that's what the United States is going to move more towards.
Imagine the emergency powers that are going to come down the pipeline. I mean, obviously the physical threat posed by nuclear war being primary, but Jesus, we haven't seen anything yet.
Well, it was certainly a softening on the health area. Now war will be and then the climate, it's just wave after wave. It's various fronts by which people are being assaulted and told, you don't control your own future. We're gonna determine your future for you, whether it's for your health, whether it's because of the war, whether it's because of the environment. They just have many, many waves by which to talk about control, exhibiting control over us.
I feel like this is probably just not a super important topic, at least insofar as you're kind of framing this whole thing, Andy, but I haven't followed this whole thing with the Ukrainian biolabs closely, but I know those documents came out this week, and a lot of people on like the independent right are kind of, all abuzz about this. Is that something you've been following? Is it a
No,
distraction in your mind, or?
no, but I will say, and I do want to do an episode on I can't remember the woman's name, a person whose theory about understanding Pfizer and Big Pharma as much more a product and captured by Department of Defense than something that's done regulatory capture on the U.S. state. She has a notion of Moderna, Pfizer, like all the entire pharmaceutical industry as essentially a wing of the Department of Defense, and I think that's probably right. And
It's
even
all
though I think
Pentagon shit with I haven't looked into it closely, but it's all Pentagon involvement in those
there's
biolabs.
certainly, yeah, and I think her theory, and this is why I'd like to, maybe we can either do an episode on either her, she did a podcast thing or a thing on YouTube, but I would also want to reach out to see if she'd be interested in being interviewed. I don't know how open she is to somebody where we're a smaller channel, but if she wouldn't do an interview, I'd certainly like us to look at it and see what we made of her theory, because I know it's somewhat controversial. In fact, a listener of ours, a person who bought a shirt, was like, wait, what is this woman talking about? Like, pharma is like running the show on a lot of this stuff, and she's kind of talking about other interests as running the show. And I kind of really think that when I think about the United States, when I think about the forces in play here, I think the military industrial, the military and the Department of Defense is much more an engine for how things go than the pharmaceutical industry or even Silicon Valley. How many times do we always come back to DARPA? And so ultimately everything is about war, not just war making abroad, but war making at home, because those things I do believe those are connected. And the more they make war abroad, they have to do war at home in order to be successful in it. So I don't know much about that biolab stuff, though, to be honest.
I was thinking, what if the USA wouldn't continue this war? They would just drop out completely. It's really upsetting to think that even, maybe this is my speculation, but that Russia would just continue then expanding itself.
The reason I think the U.S. can't do that is because a Russian victory would basically be a victory for BRICS. It would basically mean that the U.S. would no longer be seen as a power that can decide, that can rule the world through fear and through, carrots and sticks. It's one thing to lose in Iraq and Afghanistan, but to lose to a big power when you have set yourself against them as you have set that power as the existential threat to your continuing, and you lose to them, Russia's not going to advance beyond that. Russia's just going to collect all the accolades of the victor, and Russia and China will then basically be like, okay, here comes what's that? The Belt and Road Initiative. It's going to find itself right in fucking Panama. That's what's going to happen. The U.S. will find itself encircled by Russia and China economic interests, and they know that. And then before you know it, their hypersonic missiles are going to, be in a situation where, and the Chinese fleet is going to restrict where the U.S. can go eventually. And that's where this stuff's supposed to lead. So it's not Russia military advancing. Russia will be like, yeah, we'll negotiate a settlement. Of course, we're taking all the land we want. NATO can't be in, but Russia will impose harsh terms that will be seen decisively as a defeat for the United States and NATO. That will still leave even Ukraine intact, and could even see Ukraine still have a way out through Odessa in terms of being able to get off a port. But Russia will make it clear to the world that the U.S. and NATO lost because of how far this war has gone. And because of that, when the U.S. is seen as a loser, everyone is going to fade away. Everyone who said they were afraid of the United States and wanted to cut a deal with them is going to start talking to Russia and China. And the world is going to be BRICS world. And then it's really going to be China's world.
What do you mean BRICS? What's BRICS?
Just the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That's the economic alternative to G7. G7 is like, bye. You guys don't even matter anymore. WEF, fuck off.
Yeah.
And in some ways people went, oh, that's good. What WEF? But no, I mean, it is good, but it's the battle between hegemons. This is where I differ with the New World Order people. I don't think there's a collaboration to put a prison around the globe. I do think their sides are being drawn. And that's why if you listen to the World Economic Forum, you didn't hear people talking about, there wasn't a side, there was a Ukraine panel. Was there anything that was representing Russian position on that? Not at all. World Economic Forum was quite clear in saying Russia must be defeated. Ukraine must be independent, liberation. And so that's that. They're basically an outlet of a U.S. hegemony project. And if that goes down, then IMF buy, World Bank buy, WEF buy, and it's, the RGB, the other digital currency that's going to come through India and China. And we'll be spending money on that and trapped in their prison, but there will still be a war. I mean, the fact is, it's just not stable. The U.S. is not going to lose. They can't lose like that. They got to, everyone's got to lose.
Oh, my. It's time to start prepping. Start growing your food. Save your seeds and move to Idaho.
Yeah, this is just, I appreciate you both listening. I mean, it's just a place for me to think it through and for you to hear how I'm seeing it. This is why I pay so much attention to it. It's just, I can't turn away. I'm not asking you guys to, people to join me in this in terms of looking at it, but I am going to occasionally be like, hey, let me look at this again and see where things are at, because this is what's on my mind.
Right. I do think there's validity in what you're saying, that beyond Web3 and transhumanism and everything else, there is, there's a world to look after. If otherwise, there's nothing that we have left.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think your analysis necessarily negates. I mean, there's obviously ways in which, at least in its current form, this war project does serve. I mean, it's always this way, right? I mean, that's part of what makes it hard to unpack. What's the underlying thing, right? Which, you've outlined kind of your theory on that. But I mean, with anything, there's always multiple arms, right? I mean, it's it serves the project of American imperialism and NATO imperialism, right? It serves industry, on multiple weapons industry, of course, but also the U.S. Energy industry being potentially threatened, right? To the point where they'll blow up Russia's pipeline. And I think, there are a lot of ways in which this war project does serve the larger globalist WEF type transnational these types of bodies that are trying to carry out the fourth industrial revolution, I guess. But I don't know. Yeah, I mean, if we go to nuclear war, yeah, I mean, they're going to have less slaves, I suppose. Although they'll probably be more effective in enslaving those who remain or survive.
Yeah. And who was the dude who did the dimming? The guy who did the dimming documentary? Who was he? What was his name? Do you remember?
I can picture his face.
Yeah.
What's his name?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. But he's looking into all that bioengineering because he really sees that everything that's happening is an existential threat to humanity. And I don't actually disagree with him. I'm looking at this because I look at this as an existential threat to humanity. He's looking at that because I actually agree with him. And then Allison's looking at what she's looking at because she's like, this is a threat to humanity. And I agree with her. This is just my lane that I'm looking at. And it just looks a particular way to me. And I just feel like I just see other people who they have found their thing that is just terrifying them. And so they look at it and they pay attention to it and they obsess about it. That's not a criticism, that they should. And so this just apparently is the thing that I'm going to be looking at and sharing with you and others. Because there are a lot of different ways that this world is getting fucked over.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously some people are more right in their analysis of the world and their priorities than others. But I mean, I think out of the things you just named, like there's elements of truth to all of them. And in one sense, what's really scary is the ways in which they overlap. I mean, we were just like, I'm teaching a ecofeminism class and we've been reading Rachel Carson and talking about the chemical companies, back in like mid 20th century, and the parallels she draws to like nuclear radiation and like how far reaching the poisoning of the groundwater and all of, just the war. I mean, I would call it a war being waged on the American people and then globally as well on the human population. And you just think about all the overlaps with, I mean, even just the damage of like the tanks and the long range missiles and all of that shit, ecologically, in terms of human cost, in terms of taxpayer money, right? But then you think about a nuclear weapon, right? And it's like there's overlap between all of these different issues. It's war in the skies, war in the water, and then war in the trenches too.
Yeah.
Jane Wigington is the Deming guy, by the way.
Okay. Yep. So I just think it speaks to the fact that that's why this thing has to, all of us in our areas around the world have to stop our rulers and stop what they're doing and try to stopping it first. But also it really is, we have to build an alternative. I guess I have to put it that way. Is figure out how do we really want to live as humans and start doing that and be prepared to stop the people who are going to like come in and mess our stuff up.
Do you think, like, I don't know, what would it take for the American public to be genuinely scared of nuclear war? Because I don't think they are. Otherwise, there would be like a robust anti-nuclear movement, even if it was a small one.
There's going to be a demonstration in Washington, D.C. about this war on February 16th, I think. The 15th or 16th. I think that'll be interesting to see what kind of, I mean, that's just a numbers game at this point, just to see who's paying attention. But that's, in that case, that's important. I don't know the answer to that though. But I do believe that there are, when they talk about how many different ways people can die from a heart attack, but they completely leave out the shot. But they talk about setting your alarm wrong or exercising too much, all that kind of stuff.
Gardening,
Jesus, right. So, I mean, I do believe the absurdity of some of this stuff. I think something's going to start to, I mean, particularly among poor people and people who don't have much of a stake in the system in the first place. But how do we turn that into something that moves and builds itself? I don't know. But I do think people are kind of like disbelieving some of the stuff that they were believing before and thinking that they were told some lies. I think, I'm not optimistic. I mean, that's the thing. I look forward to seeing you, Jessica.
Hopefully I can get this San Francisco visit in before.
No.
Oh my God.
I still think my time frame for this is a little longer, but it feels inevitable. It feels inevitable unless we stop it. That's how it feels to me.
Dark shit.
So, right. Love the people you know now and continue to do that tomorrow. That's the lesson in general. But it's just a reminder that that's what you got to do.
Anyhow, all right. Well, that was very bleak and pessimistic.
See what the audience thinks. Yeah.
Right. Let's see what the audience says, and we invite folks to comment, to share, and see what their thoughts are, or if they challenge whatever that was discussed here. They can.
Yeah.
Well, that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast / channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests in the episode notes where we found this episode, or on our blog at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast / channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you've heard here, if you think we're still worth being around, given how Andy's pessimistic ways of sharing news and information and his analysis, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our platforms on Spotify, iTunes Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, BitChute, Odyssey, YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram. And you can find our blog and any of those links in the episode notes wherever you found this episode. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host Jessica and Andy Lipson. We say hi to you, Kenny Cepeda, wherever you're at. Hopefully you'll listen to this, and we'll see you next time. Ciao.